My friends, tonight we'll make this Jagdtiger a bit more interesting. For those of you joining in just now, this is an ongoing series on this channel and I've already done 2 videos where we dealt with construction and airbrushing. So if you want to follow the rest of this process, make sure to subscribe because only a fraction of people watching these videos are subbed. Now with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we have the model painted and varnished, so it's ready for some weathering. More specifically washes, oil dots, and some fake highlights and shadows. Those of you familiar with this channel might probably know how much I like enamel washes. I mean, pretty much every other model I built was treated with an enamel wash because I'm a big fan. Enamel wash. Brown wash for German yellow, dedicated winter camo wash, wash for German dark yellow, brown wash for German 3-tone camo, sterile. So what are we gonna use this time? False! This time we're going full oil paint and we're gonna try a dark brown oil brusher. This means mixing our wash mixture and it's nothing difficult, just put some of that oil paint onto a palette and add some enamel thinner, in this case white spirit. The consistency should be something like this, and obviously if you have some enamel wash bottles, then you have a perfect reference for how diluted the paint should be. So what's the reason for me to change my mind and go full oil paint? Well, I think you can already see the reason, but we'll get to it in a second. So basically, as I was finishing the last video, I was already thinking how I'm gonna approach the weathering. You know, should I start with a filter, then probably some oil dots, then a wash, and finally some highlights and shadows, or try something else, let's say applying the filter by speckling it on the model. Let's just say none of these options felt right to me. So I decided to start with a pin wash. And to make things more interesting, mix it from oil paints, because I used them for this task in the past, but all I can remember is how long they needed to dry, but also how easy it was to control the effect. Turns out all the negative aspects of this technique were caused by a glossy base coat, which I've been using a lot back in the day. And the satin smooth surface of this model makes a much better base for oil paints. So the oil paint wash flows much easier around details and crevices. Also, the overall application isn't as messy as with enamels. For example, when working with enamel washes, I usually resort to a very small, precise paintbrush for application and blending. But as you can see here, I'm using a pretty large cheap paintbrush from eBay. It can hold a lot of paint, so the process is much faster and more efficient. But the real benefit of oil paints is blending. The process is exactly the same. We should wait a few minutes until the wash is dry to the touch before we start blending, but then the differences are staggering. With enamel washes, it's all or nothing. You either wipe the excess wash completely or leave an ugly stain. Oil paints blend much more easily, and so the cleanup is more pleasant, but the main advantage is how we can create subtle weathering, and also shadows and color gradients, because the paint just... I don't know even how to say it. It's like we're creating a pin wash and a localized filter at the same time. So we're not just outlining details and giving the model more volume, but we're already creating some first subtle layers of weathering at the same time. One thing that made me worried was drying time. I already mentioned it a few moments ago because an oil wash, at least when I used it over a glossy surface in the past, could take a few days until it was fully dry. And by fully dry, I mean you could rub it with enamel thinner and it wouldn't move. I just wanted to clarify that so we're on the same boat. Well, first of all, this is a satin surface, so it provides the wash with better grip. It can, bite in a little better. It's not the ultimate anchor like a matte surface, it's more like a nice sweet spot in the middle. Now, of course, the drying time can be accelerated if you decide to use Oil Expert from VMS instead of enamel thinner. This will make the oil paint rock hard in very fast, and it'll make the wash flow even better. But I scheduled my workbench sessions in such a way that I was able to finish the pin wash in one evening, and then when I returned to the model the next morning, it was already fully dry. But if you want to be more efficient and do multiple steps in one session, then Oil Expert is definitely the way to go. This is of course under the condition that you won't seal the wash with a protective layer of varnish, which I'll always advise against, because it's like... it's one of the most pointless things ever. Mainly because the wash is already starting to add some unique texture to our model, you know, satin base coat combined with a matte pin wash, and another layer of varnish would destroy all of that. Another obvious advantage of using oil paints over enamel washes is price. Oils are more cost efficient and they'll last you longer, and they're definitely not going to deteriorate after a year or two like enamel paints tend to do. Honestly, this never really bothered me too much, and I liked, and I still kinda like, the convenience of pre-made enamel washes. And if you're not familiar with this technique, then I'll still recommend getting an enamel wash because it's specifically formulated and ready to use. This means that even if you never used this technique before, you're gonna have a paint that's gonna work as it should, and your experience will be more pleasant. And then, once you get familiar with how thin the paint should be, you'll have a much easier time mixing your own washes from oil paints. But okay, enough talking about washes. I think the result speaks for itself, or at least I hope it does, but when we combine a subtle pin wash with a light base coat, such as in this case, the pale colors will make it all pop very nicely. And because the wash is so subtle, the model doesn't feel so sterile like the others I did in the past. So, am I convinced? Are oil paint washes better than enamels? Yes, they are. Anyway, let's move on with some more oil paints. This time we're going to use some whites, yellows and browns for a technique with a really fancy name, oil dot blending. It's also known as oil dot filter or fading, because it gives the model a more faded look. And as you guessed, it's all about blending oil dots. So the color selection greatly depends on what color your model is. And for this camouflage I decided to use those which will work with all three base colors. If I decided to use some green oil dots, those wouldn't go very well with the red, brown and yellow. So yeah, color choice is very important. And another thing, which isn't very important, but I thought it was for a very long time, is when to use it. So, like 10 years ago, I felt like this technique should be first. Or second if you need to use a filter, which always goes first. But I thought it most definitely should be applied before washes. Why? Well, because precision isn't very important with this method, as we're gonna be completely preoccupied with their blending and making the final effect look as subtle as possible. This means the blended paints will flow around details, and if we already have a pin wash applied, it'll be quite a mess. Well, at least that's what I thought. But hey, turns out this might be a much better approach, because again, I left the pin wash to dry for several hours overnight, so it won't go anywhere. You know, I'm not gonna blend it away, and because the effect of blending oil dots is so subtle, even if they flow around some details, they won't cover up the wash. All they might do is make it a little more subtle, which I think is not a bad thing at all. In fact, quite the opposite. If the wash is too strong and the model looks sterile... I need to stop using that word, it's so annoying. So yeah, if it's just too much, this is the best way to tone it down a notch. We can also apply more dots if needed. Here I felt like the effect wasn't enough and the brown was getting too desaturated, so I simply added more browns and ochres and repeated the process. Another amazing feature of this technique is how it can blend the decals with the rest of the surface, because until now they were standing out like a sore thumb. By the way, there was some discussion about why the crosses are red and not white. Apparently it was a thing in 1945 because white crosses were like crosshairs painted on German tanks. I don't know how legit that information is, but black and white photos of this Jagdtiger 331 clearly showed the crosses were red, so, you know, it doesn't really matter why they were like that. And until now we were mostly blending the paint up and down, creating large subtle streaks of discolored paint, but on the horizontal surfaces we must switch to a tapping motion. Unless you're painting an airplane or you wanna make your tank look like it's driving at 300 miles per hour. And by the way, even on airplanes, it's hard to tell if oil dots should be blended with a tapping motion or, rather dragged in the direction of flight. I personally think they should be dragged up and down on the fuselage and tapped on the wings, because a military airplane spends more time sitting on the ground than flying through the air. But again, that's just my uninformed opinion. I never made an airplane in my life, except when I was so little I didn't even know how to walk, so take that with a pinch of salt. And I kinda went off track, so yeah, tapping motion, and that's pretty much it. Quite straightforward and easy technique. And once again, the model looks a tad bit more awesome. To be fair, if I went for a super lightweight and subtle weathering on something like a brand new vehicle, I'd be quite happy calling it done at this point. But we're gonna take it a bit further, but this next technique is highly subjective and probably won't fit everyone's needs or style, so here goes. More oil paints. This time just very pale yellow, white, dark brown and some black brown. But this time we're gonna apply and blend them in a very different way. I dropped the name of this technique in the beginning. I like to call it adding fake lights and shadows. I know, not the fanciest name. And it's all about adding fake lights and shadows. I already used the same method on the small tank hunter Rucha, where I had to paint the camouflage with a paintbrush. And although this time we sprayed the camo, its complexity doesn't lend itself to techniques like color modulation, zenithal light or distressing. Well, okay. Distressing is kinda one of the more flexible approaches out there and it can be made to work with pretty much anything, but I just didn't feel like using it on this model. Again, this is highly subjective and not everyone wants to make their model look like overexposed Blender render, but I always appreciate the extra contrast in these initial stages of painting and weathering, because a lot of the subsequent techniques are just gonna tone it down more and more with each layer. A slightly dialed down version of this technique is something I use quite frequently on pretty much all my models. That is, outlining some details with a dark brown oil paint. But now it was more about adding lights towards the upper portions of vertical plates. This can be also used to a high degree of success when distinguishing individual slabs of armor, which pays off even more on these German tanks with interlocking steel plates. It's also a nice and subtle way to highlight small details. This can also be done with a brush and painting them with a lighter tone, which is ideally done during the airbrushing stage, but this approach is easier to control and, if you're not happy, you can wipe the highlight away. I kept shadows on this model quite limited, pretty much just below this stack of gun cleaning rods and around some large hatches. Because overall, this model doesn't have too many complex shapes, and so, too many shadows would look, well, more unnatural than what we already have. The oxide primer sections were highlighted with some desaturated orange color, and here you can go either way, either with yellow, so adding yellow into red, which will result in orange color, or with white, which will be more pinkish and desaturated. It's just a matter of taste, but I personally like my oxide primer with some orange hues. And of course, our favorite detail on this channel, adding a fake shadow on the gun barrel. This obviously distinguishes the barrel from the mantlet, but it can also add a hint of grime and other horribleness which can possibly collect around this part when the gun, when it travels during recoil. And I don't know if you noticed any difference, but I was filming this gun barrel segment with 2 lights instead of 3, because this boyo decided to game end himself and blow all fuses in my house. And even though I ordered replacement bulbs immediately, it might take up to 8 days until they arrive. So in the meantime, I'll have to film with only 2 light sources. So I hope the next video will be watchable. And that actually brings me to the concluding segment, my friends. So the next video will be made in this light restricted mode with only 2 lamps, and it'll be all about chipping. And of course also rust tones and probably some streaking effects. So if you don't wanna miss it again, make sure you're subscribed, bell icon and everything. And for those of you already subbed, same time next week. Also, I hope you enjoyed the video and hopefully found it helpful or at least interesting to watch, and if yes, then give it a like because it helps me a lot. And if not, then hit that dislike because that also helps me to some extent. So this episode was all about oil paints. Oil paint wash, oil dot blending and oil paint color modulation, kinda. Yeah, I gotta say working with oil wash is extremely satisfying and efficient. Like, I did it in one evening while normally it might take me like an entire day or even 2 days with Enamel, so that's really cool, although I'm the slowest modeler ever, so any normal modeler would need just a fraction of time. And same with oil dots, super easy and fast, and the only thing that took me 2 days were the highlights and shadows. This technique also gets boring pretty fast after a few hours, so I guess it's better to know when to stop or just, focus on the most important parts. And yeah, that's gonna be it for now, my friends. So, thank you for watching, also thank you to my incredible patrons who make this weekly show possible. And if I didn't mention it already, my Patreon page is like a magazine subscription, because you're getting tons of extra content in return, such as almost daily photo updates where I discuss progress after each session, and I'm also talking about various things such as, well, in this case it was more about oil paints and enamel washes, also about, the order of techniques and so on. Then of course 1 week early ad-free videos, so you'd be able to watch the chipping episode right now. Also very large HD photos like these in the background, which you can download and save for your personal reference purposes. And of course DMs, so you can show me your model or ask for advice or anything you can think about. So that's gonna be it for tonight. Stay safe, my friends, build your models and have fun. Enjoy your weekend or day or evening, depending on when you're watching this, and I'll see you again in the next one. Cheers!